So I've been spending more time on Reddit lately, just kind of in the build your own PC or just PC Master Race or PCMR, and just kind of keeping an eye on what people are kind of suggesting when someone has a question about a certain topic. And I've seen this topic come up quite a bit. It's referring fan configurations, specifically the fans on top of the case, and asking which is the best configuration. Well, there was a picture that's kind of been circulating, and I have some problems with this picture, so I decided to test the configurations in this to see if the temperatures that are showing up on here are even close to being accurate. For those looking for a high-end custom gaming experience, look no further than Falcon Northwest. Falcon Northwest has been building PCs made for gamers for over 30 years with a focus on a true high-end gaming experience. Custom cases available only through Falcon Northwest feature state-of-the-art testing and design to ensure that every component is performing at their best through thermal imaging and rigorous lab testing designed and overseen by the Falcon Northwest founder himself. With a complete lineup of systems ranging from small to large, every Falcon Northwest system includes a 3-year warranty policy and a year of 2-way overnight shipping coverage, providing the ultimate peace of mind. To see all that Falcon Northwest has to offer, follow the sponsored link in the description below. So there's 3 configurations here. Now we'll be talking about, like I said, specifically the top of the case. This is a LandCool 216. It's not the exact same case that's sitting here on this image. But what I've done to kind of mimic it as best as I can is I've taped off the mid plate to make sure that there's no airflow or anything being affected by the bottom of the case. The LandCool also has a fully vented side right here, so that's taped up to make sure no airflow can be affected by that panel. So I'm trying to mimic this as best I can. They show 3 120mm Noctua fans in the front. I have 2 160mm LandCool 216 fans in the front. So basically the front is full intake, and that's fine because in this configuration that they're showing, the ABC configuration here, they show those basically as all intake. I'm assuming there's no arrows on there, but the A, B, and C configuration that they're talking about, I added a 4th one on there, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. The first one is pretty standard. We're assuming we have an air cooler here, and this is only going to really pertain to those that are running air coolers. An AIO would be a completely different story here. An air cooler obviously is passing air through the towers, through the heat sinks, and then out the back of the case. So the rear fan here in this configuration, and all of them also, we're assuming is set to exhaust. Again, there's no arrows. So this is why this image already kind of bothers me, because the full fan configurations really should work as a system and not just change around a bunch on the top and not taking into account airflow pathways or how they all work in conjunction with each other, because it is a system here. But the first configuration, I'm calling A, if you will. They're not actually labeled on here, but we'll just call it A now for simplicity, would be all fans on the top as an exhaust. And that's kind of typical. Most people would do that. They would have intakes and exhaust. And it's exhaust, not outtake, by the way. So if you've ever written outtake, it's exhaust. That's the first one here, which would be all intakes, all exhaust, and then the back is obviously an exhaust. Next, for B, would be having 2 exhausts in the rear, and then the front one being an intake. So the idea there is that this fan is blowing cold air in front of the fan that's for the heatsink. So that seems logical, right? It seems like you would say, hey, that cold air will come down and then go through the heatsink and then out, or potentially out the top right here. The next configuration, which we'll call configuration C, is where they have the 2 front fans as intakes, and then this is an exhaust and this is an exhaust. So now we only have 2 exhaust, but we have a lot of CFM worth of intake. And then the one that I'm gonna I added to this, which they didn't do, which is all 3 on the top is intake. So that's almost like what we're gonna dub the Alienware method, because their new Area 51 PC uses all intakes and no exhaust fans whatsoever. In fact, to truly mimic that, we would have to have removed the rear exhaust fan, and then it just works on the concept of full positive pressure only. So that's the 4th configuration I put on here, which is all intakes. Now let's talk about the hardware I'm using here real quick. The other thing that bugs me is they show CPU temps and they show GPU temps. There's no mention whatsoever what the hardware is on this. So I'm assuming this might be an image that was potentially taken from maybe a publication or a website somewhere that has maybe some explanation to go along with it, but there's none on this image. But if the image is what's being circulated, you kind of have to have the info to go along with it. So the system I built here is actually a 13900K, because Intel equal hot. So we want to check hot, right? I have a 4080 Super right here because, let's face it, 4090s and 5090s are not really representative of the bulk of the consumers. Neither is a 4080. But I have to generate some heat. We kind of have to Mythbusters this a little bit, where we have to create a situation where there is heat to move to see anything that's happening here. The RAM really doesn't matter. The power supply, none of that truly matters. Now the cooler we have on here is a Noctua. It is the D15S, I believe it is. It's a twin tower cooler. It's got a 140 fan in the middle that works as a push-pull, and then I've added the Be Quiet fan on the front. So we have a push-pull situation, and then a pull technically right behind it. The idea here is the air just travels straight through the cooler and right out the back of the case. Something else to mention here too is the fact that I didn't use, one of the reasons why I didn't want to use an FE for a 50 series card is because of the fact that when it comes to the 4080s, 4090, or excuse me, 5080s, 5090s, those are dual blow-through design, which would be completely different, I think. And all of the custom cards too only have a rear blow-through, and everything else is kind of like a normal, axial fans, which would exhaust it out the back of the case. If I had a flow-through right here on the back side of the CPU, I don't know how that would technically affect the overall results. So I'm trying to mimic what I'm seeing right here in this image as best I can. And this image does not have a dual flow-through design. So you also need to keep in mind, I've seen a lot of people have said this, the hot air coming out through the back fan right here could potentially be picked up by the front of the CPU cooler and then heat up your CPU cooler. That has been debunked. It's actually been debunked quite a bit. We debunk it in today's video, you'll see. But more importantly, I know you all want to take Steve's word for it. He has the technology and the Schlieren camera and all that to be able to actually see the heat. You can visually see the heat. And through all that testing, when 30 series first came out, because that's where we first saw the blow-through style cooler, initially when the pictures of those launched, everyone was like, oh my God, that's just gonna heat your CPU up. That's terrible, terrible, terrible. It literally doesn't matter. That is what's pretty cool about that. I think that's just because the force of the fan pushing the heat up so fast absolutely does not get picked up by the CPU cooler, because the air coming in the front has such high velocity too that it's kind of crazy when you use the smoke machine to see the flow of the air. You're like, oh yeah, I get now why they can say it really doesn't matter. Not just do the temps represent that, but the actual seeing the airflow through smoke or the vapor in our instance here, or even the Schlieren camera that Steve uses, that's fully debunked. No discussion to be had there today. No one should even be commenting on any of that. It truly doesn't matter. But what I would have thought, as we get into the results here in a moment, is by having these, either the one or the two fans as intake, I would have thought that those opposing air forces with the GPU air coming up and then the intake air coming down would be a problem. But I'll be honest, all the exhaust makes out the rear anyway, because the front fans are pushing so much CFM, everything is shoved to the back anyway. And so much cool air is being mixed in with the GPU heat. I think that's one of the reasons why the CPU also truly doesn't get negatively affected. So moving on, I used two different test configurations for this. I used Furmark 2 in 4K, specifically to see how the airflow affects the GPU temps without the CPU being taken into account, because Furmark obviously doesn't hit the CPU at all. And then I used Cyberpunk 2077 in 1440p with Ray Tracing Ultra. So we kind of hit middle ground there, where it's lower resolution, so higher frame rates, so we can get the CPU to have to do a little more. But then obviously RT to put the GPU under load at the same time, so that we can see, if there's any configuration that's going to hurt the GPU or help the GPU more or whatever. So those are the configurations there. So let's go ahead and start. Heck, I guess this could just be the TLDR. Let's start with the bar graph in Cyberpunk 2077. Are you ready? Which config do you think won? None of them. Absolutely none of them. It truly made no difference. Now you'll see right here, I have my KTH thermal probe. This was just because I was testing, one, I'm making sure that, and it's not charted on here, but I do have the intake temps and the exhaust temps all measured. It was just curious to see how the exhaust temperatures varied based on those configurations. And that's because the exhaust temp is getting split and where it's coming out in different ways. So by having all intakes on the top, the exhaust temp, even though I was like, oh, all the heat will be coming out the back right here, it's data that really doesn't mean anything when it comes to the exhaust data, because so much cold air is coming in from this fan right here, and it's just going right to the exhaust fan. And so it's just, the air is mixing, the temperature's mixed, so it really doesn't mean anything. If anything, the intake probe temp on the front of the case allows me to really chart and show that the ambient temperature in the room is locked solid at, it says 22C on the chart, it was actually like 21.8C, like solid across the board. So we don't have variables with intake temps or anything on this case. It is absolutely consistent. But this is the average temperatures across the entire 15-minute runs. So you can see here, technically I have this charted by hottest on top and coolest on bottom. It's funny how the 3 exhaust is the coolest, but let's talk about GPU temps in Cyberpunk. 55.16 versus 55.27 versus 55.29 and 55.71. We have about 0.55 to 0.6 of a degree difference across the board. Now that's specifically for the GPU. The CPU, as you can see here, the coldest actually was the 3 intake, and that makes sense because I think a lot of that cold air is also blowing directly across these fins. These fins do allow air to come through in different ways. So it was just blowing more cold air at the CPU, which obviously helped. But again, from the hottest temp on there at 51.42 with the 2 intakes and 1 exhaust versus the 3 intake, a difference of 49.59 versus 51.42. I mean, again, we're talking 2.1 C. The reason why I wanted to check that is if you look in the picture, we referenced that again, you can see they show some drastically changing CPU temps, like 84.3 versus 83.5 versus 89.9. Like, no, that's not what we experienced in this whatsoever. So it would also really help to know what CPU they were running on this, because we would want to try and recreate this as best as possible, but no information with that. Now, one thing to also point on this that's really important with this testing is the fans are locked. So the GPU fans were locked to 70%. And I did max the power limits and stuff. I really wanted to try and generate some heat, but because if one config was overall cooler, if we let the fan curves do their thing, then the fans would slow down, which would mean they could potentially end up around the same temperature, but then the fan speeds would be lower. So they would look the same, but then what would happen is the acoustics would change. That's about one of the only things that could happen here. But because the fans were locked off at 70%, and you can see the temperatures for the GPU absolutely were unfazed, that means the RPMs and the overall acoustics would have stayed the same because it would have kept hitting the same temperatures anyway. Same thing with the CPU. The CPU I had set to 80% fan speed in the BIOS because we need to have it locked off. Otherwise, we're now playing with how does fan configuration affect fan curve, which doesn't tell the whole story. So that's why everything with the system is locked off. Same thing with the frequencies on the CPU. Locked at 5.3 gigahertz on the, or excuse me, 5.5 gigahertz on the P core and 4.3 gigahertz on the E core. So really treated like we do with our GPU benchmark rig, where everything is very controlled and locked down. So that's Cyberpunk. Let's go ahead and talk about Furmark, because one of the things I was curious about now is will the GPU potentially warm up the CPU, right? If the CPU is sitting there idle, not doing much, and this will really be represented when we talk about how it affects things over time. I do have a time graph, which we'll show you after the bar charts here. On whether or not we're warming up our CPU by warming up the GPU, which would be natural, honestly, for any configuration because of the fact that the GPU is generating a warmer interior temperature. So if the CPU is sitting idle at, say, 35 C and the GPU is now suddenly 60 C, you would see the CPU come up slightly. So in terms of these, though, you can see what I also charted on top is the throttle threshold. What temperature would your component start to slow down? So the question is like, are we even causing a problem for any of our components? And as you can see here with a hard throttle threshold of 105 C for the CPU, no, we're not even halfway there. And then with an 85-degree hard throttle threshold for the graphics card sitting here in the mid 50s, literally at 55 C. Now we got 30 degrees of headroom. So yeah, absolutely none of these configurations would even begin to affect the performance of your components. If we look at the same thing for Furmark, obviously Furmark is a higher load than even something like Cyberpunk. So our temps came up a little bit, but again, it's 60.25 versus the hottest temp of 61.23. So we're literally talking 1 degree of difference. So if we go back to Cyberpunk, it's kind of funny because the best CPU temp was 3 intake and the best GPU temp was 3 exhaust, which makes sense because the cold air is blowing on the CPU cooler. And for exhaust, it's bringing the hot air away from the CPU fast. Anyway, moving on, for Furmark, you can see the hottest our CPU temp got was 37.2 with the 3 intake, which is really kind of ironic. But again, 37.2 versus 36.4, 36.6, 36.7, again, a wash, no change whatsoever. And if you take a look again for the throttle temp for the GPU at 85C, I mean, we've got from the hottest temps, we got 24 degrees Celsius of additional TJ Max available to us. So again, makes no difference whatsoever. Let's go on to the line graphs. The line graphs paint an awesome visual story. So if you look at Cyberpunk, I start the logging while we're sitting at the Steam page, basically. And then I start the log and then I hit play. So you can see the GPU ramp up. You can see the dip in GPU is actually when we're in the loading screen to load our game save. Because the menu is actually rendered by the GPU. Then the game save, when that's loading, that isn't rendering anything. It's just a splash screen. And then when you're in the game, it ramps up. So that's why there's that big dip, if you're wondering what that is. But if you take a look here, I have essentially the main chart is kind of like the full temperature range. I have it going to 90 instead of 85, but you can see we're so far away from any of these configs causing any sort of thermal issue whatsoever for our GPU. In fact, if you zoom in and I make the range only 25 to 70, you can see that they're all over each other, right? I already showed you, it's like 1C difference, right? From worst to best. So if we take a look now at Furmark though, because Furmark is a much more higher stress load, it actually keeps the temperatures much more steady because in the game, as different things are happening, the GPU kind of goes under a constant change in load. But Furmark does a good job of just keeping that pegged 100% at all times. Look at this, indiscernible difference whatsoever when it comes to temperatures. So if we zoom in and you take a look at the temperatures, you can see that there is a 1.5 degree swing between the lowest and the highest and where they're landing right there. And then same thing, if you take a look at CPU, the CPU fluctuates a lot in gaming. So you can see the temperatures of the CPU just literally all over the place. But if you take a look at the purple line, you can see it's just slightly lower than everything else. That's the 3 intake. But again, when I say slightly, what we show was like 1C. And if we look at Furmark, you can see graph over time. There's a slight increase of temperature, right? Because the averages only tell the average. It doesn't show what happened over time. You can see there's just a slight climb, barely a climb for all 4 configurations, which shows that it absolutely was not affecting our CPU temps whatsoever. So final thoughts here. In my opinion, it's the 2 cents in the name of the channel. The configuration that should really prioritize dust management more so than potentially even airflow or cooling for your components. Obviously, as you go with something like a 5090 or maybe even like a Threadripper or something like that, then we might see the numbers become a bit more separated. But we had to kind of pick a way here that really sort of represented more of the average consumer or maybe upper average consumer, considering these are high-end components because we do have to generate heat, which only begs to show that if you're running something like a 9700X and like a 5070 or a 3070, it matters even less because you're generating even less heat than these components. So if you're gonna be running all intake on the top though, I actually am thinking I might run all intakes on my personal system. I know I did this with my personal rig with the radiators. It's different with a radiator though, totally different with a radiator. You wanna get as much fresh air through the rads as possible. So like if I have a rad up top and a rad on the bottom, having fresh air come in through those, but then you need to, we're talking about a very efficient transfer of heat into a very focused area, which means now you need to be able to get that heat out of the system as fast as possible too. So your exhaust configuration is very important on that. So I've got some more playing around to do with mine. But it really doesn't matter. It just make sure you're filtering your intakes if you're doing that. Now, obviously, if you're doing a single intake or a 2 intake with a 1 exhaust, or you're mixing and matching on the top, unless you're gonna go cutting your fan filter, you're not gonna be able to efficiently filter the intakes and then have free-flowing exhaust. There's no reason to filter your exhaust whatsoever, because that then is trapping the dust in the system technically. You want that dust to move out with the airflow if possible. Positive pressure is better when it comes to dust management because it makes sure that all of the air coming in is through fans. As long as those fans are filtered, then the dust is gonna be caught by the filter, at least a majority of it. And then it's just pushing air out every vent it possibly can, obviously through active air movement like an exhaust fan, or obviously you have your passive exhaust, which would be the pressure pushing itself through the vents, whether it be the IO vents or like a vent right here. Heck, even positive pressure in this case, if this was untaped, we would see air and smoke coming out the side right here. So it really just doesn't matter. Yeah, oh, also one other thing I want to point out, one of the things I thought could potentially have happened that I was able to visually kind of represent doesn't happen, is I thought if we were gonna have like 1 intake right here, and then these were exhaust, that the hot air could get picked up by the intake fan and then circulate hotter air through here, and it would just slowly warm up. The force at which these fans is pushing the heat away is so strong that there literally is like a pressure wall right here, and they don't interfere with each other. In fact, you can even see it with the smoke right here, that the smoke is rising so fast, and by moving it left and right, you can see the physical divide. It is not swirling back around into the intake. In fact, when I had 2 intake, 1 exhaust, the best we got was a little like swirl, but the swirl still went up. The swirl didn't go into the fan. It went up, and it just looked like a little dirt devil. You would have to be moving the fan so slowly to have one pick up the other and create an actual vortex this way that you would be getting warm already because of the lack of heat exchange rate. So it's a wash. There we go. I saw this picture and it bothered me when I saw it because I thought it looked like a bunch of horse shit, and it kind of works out to be that way. So what's your guys' best fan config? As you can see, in our instance, in this scenario, it didn't matter.